The topic is, well, the title, Economic Crisis and Evolution of Electoral Lefts in Latin America and Southern Europe. The broad research question is actually very broad. I mean, it's very generic. Although we notice different evolution of Latin American and Southern European left sides of the party systems in the aftermath of economic crisis due to shortcomings of neoliberal model, albeit in different times. And in a few cases, we observe the strengthening of the existing leftist parties, such as, for example, in Uruguay with the Frente Amplio, or in Portugal with the Portuguese radical left, the Communist Party and the Bloco de Esquerda. But in most of the cases, we saw the emergence of new political populist projects. So the question obviously is why? Why we observe this variation? And can populism be treated as a monolithic category? Is really useful to consider populism as a unique big category instead of looking for the variation within this category. I think that, in fact, it's not a monolithic category, and the different populist projects we observed varied in terms of party organization, in terms of social basis of the electorate, and in terms of relationship with the union movement. The case selection is very specific. Is the former easy countries, easy means industrialization through the substitution of importation, in Latin America and Southern Europe. Why this is important? I think that these two regions share crucial scope conditions that are causally relevant to explain the outcome we will observe. In both regions, the countries included facing dramatic economic crisis due to the contradiction of neoliberal model. In Latin America, basically during the 19th and the early years of the new century, and in Southern Europe since 2008 with the so-called Great Recession. And all the countries that I selected are countries with dualized welfare regimes and with union movements with strong historical linkages to political parties from the left. And I think that these are very important to stress because it forms the starting conditions of the political parties when the crisis occurred. So I selected in Latin America Bolivia, Argentina, Venezuela, and Uruguay, and in Southern Europe, well, the four countries: Spain, Greece, Italy, and Portugal. My dependent variable is I define it as the most successful political project that emerged in the aftermath of the crisis, decisively shaping the left side of the party spectrum, which means that it does not necessarily is, at least at the beginning, a proper leftist project, but it is an anti-neoliberal project which is able to attract strong support from leftist electorate. And then I focused on the the Bolivian mass, the Venezuelan Chavism, Argentine Kirchnerismo, and Uruguayan Frente Amplio. And in Southern Europe, the Spanish Podemos, Italian Movimento 5 Stelle, Greek Syriza, and the Portuguese radical left. And I will look precisely at the different party organizations of such projects and the electoral basis, their electoral basis. Just to understand, how I will categorize the different outcome. For now, I will focus just on the label of the different outcome. I observed that in some cases, some existing parties were able to adapt to the post-crisis scenario. But in one case, in the first yellow box, we have the stability of the old labor-based left, while in the other case, we observe the rise of a populist project with a populist discourse, but rooted in a pre-existing party, which is basically the case of Kirchnerismo in Argentina and Syriza in Greece. In the other two boxes, in the blue ones, I categorize those populist projects that emerged, as newly born populist parties. In one case, I labeled movement-based populism because the social movements that emerged in the aftermath of the crisis had a very strong influence in terms of political platform and in terms of candidate selection in the new parties. And there are the cases of the MAS in Bolivia. Yep.
This is the outcome you want to explain?
Yeah.
You have four.
Yeah, four different paths, I mean. And the movement-based populism is basically the Bolivian MAS and the Spanish Podemos, while leader-initiated populism is a kind of political project that has present strong top-down features, and it is led by a political maverick, who is able, by different organizational linkages, to link with the movements that emerge against the crisis, and via charismatic linkages in order to appeal to atomized and popular constituencies. And this is the case of Chavismo and of the Five-Star Movement in Italy. More than independent variables, I would say that these are the factors that I take into account to properly understand the different outcomes. I identify a set of critical antecedents in terms of, that came before the crisis, which acts as a critical juncture of my causal model. And these critical antecedents are the evolution of the Union Party hubs, and basically the old structures of socio-political intermediation of the old left, the working class left, and focusing on the resilience of the party-society linkages between the old left and the voters, their eventual ability of representing broader sectors than the salaried working class, and the degree of centripetal turn during the neoliberal phase, the degree to which these old left embraced neoliberalism and contributed to implement market-friendly reforms in labor market issues or in monetary policies in order to adapt to the new economic environment produced since the 80s. And this, I think, is one factor to take into account in order to understand if those parties were able to play a relevant role even after the collapse of the model. The second set of factors is the characteristics of the social movements that emerged as a reaction to the crisis, and I focus precisely on the demands that these movements advanced and their capacity of alliance building, which I think is crucial to understand how they really concretely influence the political electoral arena after their emergence. And obviously, if no party was able to adapt itself through different ideological and organizational resources that I will explain soon, we will observe a political window of opportunity was open for the emergence of a new political project. So we will fall into the blue boxes. And the research design that I use is basically a comparative historical analysis, where economic crisis is the relevant critical juncture, creating the opportunity for long-lasting diverging paths. Causal homogeneity is assured by causally relevant scope condition, motivating the case selection, as I explained. Data collection has been carried on through in-depth interviews with 120 national and regional party representatives, union leaders, and social movements activists in 4 different countries, plus a quite broad secondary literature, particularly in historical, and also survey data to analyze the social composition of the electorates of the parties under investigation. What the literature told us up to now about the effects of the crisis of neoliberalism on the party systems. As Ken arguing in his book, Latin American party systems were more likely to change when market reforms were implemented by labor-based party in former easy countries. And as Morgan said, the party system collapses occurred in countries affected by huge economic crisis, where the main political parties reduced their programmatic differences. I mean, the centripetal move of the old left toward the center. And while clientelistic, identitarian, and organizational linkages got weaker for different reasons. Clientelism were more difficult to sustain because of state retrenchment, because the state lacked the resources that owned before the crisis. Because identitarian and organizational linkages got weaker because there was a tendency towards party cartelization, which is a very important concept in political science, meaning that political parties basically occupied the state instead of rooting themselves into the society in order to drain resources for their functioning. And also, well, programmatic differences disappear because of international pressure that imposed market reforms in both regions through the access to the Eurozone or through, for example, currency pegging in several Latin American countries. So different scholars have argued that these were the perfect condition for the rise of left-wing populism. However, populism is, heterogeneous categories in which very different phenomena in terms of ideology, party organization, and relationship with civil society exist, as different scholars have noticed. My point is that we have to explain why we arrived to different organizational forms and different social bases of these parties. Coming back to the critical antecedents that I mentioned before, I think that the transformation of party-union relationship are crucial to understand why the old left was often unable to resist to the crisis in terms of popular support. In both regions, the unions had been for a long time the main organizational linkage between the parties and the societies. And before the neoliberal turn in all the countries selected, the unions enjoyed a preferential access to the polity domain through the parties, and strengthened the protection of the insiders of the labor market, which are basically the full-time salaried workers with open-ended contracts. In Southern Europe, the size of these constituencies was generally bigger than in Latin America, but still in countries like Argentina or Uruguay or Venezuela, still the size of this category, of these constituencies, was very high and allowed to have a stable base of support for the leftist parties before the crisis. And as David Rueda highlighted, basically these union party hubs, the big structures of socio-political representation, basically advanced the interest of the insiders, both the working class, the true core constituency of such parties. But this came to an end due to the end of the old easy matrix. So we have changes in productive structure, decrease in union density, growth of the outsider sectors who are precarious workers and in fixed-term contract workers in Southern Europe, self-employed workers, or the vast informal sectors in several Latin American countries. So the unions were, I would say, trapped into two different risks. They became less useful for the parties because they represented a smaller constituencies, but still the unions needed a point of access to the polity domain to contrast even more radical labor market reforms. So on the one side, they run the risk of acting as purely economic corporatist actors, representing a smaller insider sectors, and thus failing to represent also outsider grievances and increase the size of their constituencies. On the other side, because of their links to the labor-based, the old left, they run the risk of being perceived as accomplices of labor market reforms, which is the case, for example, of the CGT in Venezuela, or the CGT in Argentina, or the CTV in Venezuela. So both the insiders and the outsiders have the different grievances against the old structures of political intermediation. And albeit, deriving from different sources, these grievances had the potential to converge around demands for new forms of political participation, more inclusive of the interests of the outsiders and more responding to the rank of files, instead of to be highly influenced by would say the orders of the political parties. On the other side, both popular sectors began asking for expansive economic policies to react against the crisis, and to implement universalist social policies in order to properly protect the outsider sectors, which in the old welfare regime in both countries were basically left unprotected, because for example, unemployment insurances or health insurances typically depended on the labor status of the worker. If you had not a job, you wouldn't have not access to the social protection. It was very tightly linked to the labor status. And well, the corollary of all this reasoning is that those Union Party hubs that currently kept an oppositional stance during the pre-crisis era, and they were able to appeal through programmatic or organizational linkages to the growing outsider sectors. Well, still these kind of Union Party hubs had the opportunity of defending their legitimacy as a reliable alternative to the dominant model when the neoliberalism showed its deficiencies, its contradiction in both regions. I will not focus on this table, but it's just, if you want, I can to explain it later. But basically, it is a table sketching the different risks and opportunities faced by the existing left of center parties when the crisis occurred, and the different strategies they had, they could follow in order to find a way of adapting themselves to a socio-political scenario in which popular discontent was mounting. I'm going now to the second set of factors that I consider crucial to understand the final outcomes, which is the characteristics of social mobilization in the two regions. In Latin America, the social movements often emerge to organize atomized constituencies for obtaining immediate responses to their needs from the state. I would think about the Argentine piqueteros or the Venezuelan buhoneros, which are the street vendors in the main Venezuelan cities. In this case, the frontier between social movement and interest group is blurred, because these kind of movements were fighting for very particularistic response from the state to find a way to cope with the daily necessities during harsh times. There was also a kind of Polanyian reaction against social commodification brought by market-friendly reforms led by indigenous leaders, such as in Ecuador, for example, and mainly in Bolivia. Here, the frontier between social movement and corporatist group are blurred, because basically these kind of movements represented very rooted constituencies and very well organized constituencies that were found that were struggling for higher state resources to, for example, for productive goals and for infrastructural works. In addition, we had social movements advancing much broader demands in terms of, end of cuts in public spending, such as the Argentine Frente Nacional contra la Pobreza, or demands for a regeneration of democracy, which was seen as basically inefficient and too much skewed toward towards the defense of particularistic interests of some elite. And there were strong demands for popular participation. And we saw it, for example, in Bolivia with the campaign for the Constituent Assembly. But this also in Venezuela. There was a strong demand for a big reform of the political regime from Punto Fijo. And the role of the trade unions were quite peripheral. As well, in some cases, they were too identified with political parties. They were basically targeted by the protesters as accomplices of the regime, such as Venezuela or in Argentina, or they were too weak because of state repression during the previous years, such as in Bolivia. So they didn't play a central role in the protest, with the exception of Uruguay, where the PIT-CNT was basically the strongest player in the political and social arena to fight against labor market reforms, and it was probably more rooted than the Frente Amplio itself during the 90s, and also enjoyed strong access to the political domain through the use of referenda and of strikes in order to counteract the market-friendly reform. So it defended a strong legitimacy as an anti-neoliberal actor even before the crisis. In Southern Europe, we observed the formation of what Aslanidis called the populist social movements, such as the Spanish Indignados or the Greek Anarchismenoi. It were broad anti-establishment movements calling for restoration of popular and national sovereignty against political and economic castes. This was the main frame of these protests. And particularly in Spain, we saw an impressive ability of alliance building displayed by the Indignados with other single issues movements, such as the PAS, which are basically a movement struggling against bank evictions due to unpaid loan mortgage, and the Mareas, which were movements struggling against cuts in public spending in educational or health areas, or for example for gender equality. So all of these movements, albeit often quite with advancing a quite specific demands, inserted themselves in a broader frames which was opened by the Indignados protest. But in Italy and in Greece, in contrast, we saw a very fragmented scenario in which the social movement remained isolated through divided through ideological lines, or they remained focused on local campaigns, and they were not able to upscale their protest to the national level and to build a common front similar to the Indignados one in Spain. The trade unions played a limited role also in Southern Europe, particularly in Spanish and Greeks. and they were clearly targeted as part of the old regime. I mean, they were considered just as transmission bells of the socialist parties in Spanish and in Greece. They were highly delegitimized. Leftist unions were much more central in Italian mobilizations, but they remained confined through by sectorial lines, and basically they stopped their activity since the Berlusconi's fall. So their protests were not so much against austerity by itself, but against Berlusconi, against the right of center government at the time, and we observed a steer decline in the contentious activities by the unions when Mario Monti's executive went to power. Monti is a technocrat, but he was supported also by the Democratic Party, which is the party of reference at the time of Italian trade unions. The exceptions was Portugal. In Portugal, the CGTP played a very central role in leading the protests in the streets. It was able to establish strong linkages with other social movements struggling against job precariousness, and both the communist Portuguese communist parties and the leftist bloc in Portugal were able to get involved into the protest, and in some to some extent to influence them and to channel through the institutional channels the popular discontent, thus strengthening their legitimacy in the Portuguese system. So I argue here that well, the main effects of the social movements was to challenge the monopolistic representational function of the existing parties. In countries where civil societies were traditionally weak, and political parties played for a long time a gatekeeping role for the access to the policy domain. They challenged the movement challenged this monopolistic representational function, and politicizing new cleavages, created new frames, and crucially produced numerous militants potentially ready to engage with electoral politics, and that did not feel represented by the existing system. So I sketch these threefold categorization of the kind of anti-neoliberal social mobilization that we observed. I already, I would say, anticipated a lot about these different patterns. Basically, we have the union-led protests in Portugal and Uruguay. We have the unified kind of social mobilization in Bolivia and Spain, basically because the movements were very strong and able to build strong alliances and unify their struggles around single master frames. And we have the fragmented scenario, which is the case of Argentina, Venezuela, Greece, and Italy, where we have disaggregated protests with different social constituencies struggling for their particularistic claims or divided along ideological lines. So here the point is how which is the heritage of these movements in terms of the effects of such a fragmented scenario on the political electoral arena, and we will see that it depends on the behavior, on the strategy followed by the political parties, if they were able or not to represent, to play a kind of brokerage role between these different fragmented movements in order to unify them around a single project. So we came just to the end to understand the role of populism in all of this account. Left-wing populism was a I argue that the third populist wave in Latin America, and after the classic populism during the 50s by Domingo Perón, Getulio Vargas, or even before Cárdenas and Betancourt, and the neo-populist wave of the 90s. In Europe, populism for a long time was equated with the radical right, such as the French bourgeoisism, the Italian qualunquismo, anti-tax parties in Northern Europe, ethno-nationalist parties, particularly since the 90s in Central Europe or in Italy. And the emergence of anti-austerity populism in Southern Europe challenged these oversimplifications. I opted for provide an operational definition of populism in order to stress which are for me the characteristics that allowed populism to be so widespread in the aftermath of an economic crisis. I think it's a political project aiming at occupying the public institution through electoral means in order to allow the people for recuperating its sovereignty while relying on an antagonistic and polarizing political discourse to generate new collective identities and on varying, we will see how, organizational resources to overcome the problems of collective action that could arise among dispersed and or heterogeneous constituencies. And I just want to focus on two different understandings of the way populisms articulate the demands of the people and intend the representation of the people into the political arena. We have historically an electoral delegative populism in which a strong man basically embodies the people and advance a strong, I would say, autonomous discourse and established an unmediated relationship between him and the masses and the followers. But we have also a participative mobilizing populism, which is quite close to the charismatic parties described by Panebianco in his path-breaking book. We have the coexistence of a strong leadership which acts as an arbitrator of different demands, of different demands coming from social sector which can be either organized or not. And at the same time, there is a kind of movementist organization at the periphery of the party. There is a strong overlapping membership between these kind of parties and the social movements that surround the electoral instrument, the proper political party, and struggle to influence the strategic decision of the party. So the role of the leader is much more being an arbitrator, a mediator between different demands and organization, than to establish a proper direct relationship with the followers. And taking a much more historical view, electoral delegative populism was much more widespread in neoliberal populism, on the radical right-wing populism. But in the classic populism and in the anti-neoliberal populism, we have stronger organized constituencies that impact much more on the function, the internal functioning of the political party. So this is basically the different paths that we have and the different, I would say, combination of our factors that I take into account. We had the stable pattern, the first one, which led to the strengthening of the labor-based left, or we have the path in which the movements, strong unified mobilizations, led to the creation of a political opportunity for a movement populism. And in the other cases where mobilization are fragmented, we have the path that I labeled the party-rooted populism or leader-initiated populism. And this bifurcation depends on the ability of an existing party to switch to a populist political discourse and to have the needed organizational resources to cope with a fragmented socio-political scenario. And if we look at the second yellow box, these characteristics are basically an ideological vagueness and internal pluralism, high decentralization of the party in the periphery, which allows, I mean, in a somewhat incoherent way, the party to root and to dialogue with different movements and to insert their demands into the political platform of the party, whose coherence is guaranteed by a strong leadership that, as I explained before, acted as an arbitrator of different demands. And while in the other cases, I already quite deeply explained the different patterns. But for example, in the fourth box, where we have a very fragmented scenario of social mobilization, in the absence of such a party that is able to mediate between the different movements, there is still a strong popular discontent triggered by the crisis and fed by the mobilization that opened the way for a political maverick. Then through a quite I would say direct appeals to unorganized constituencies or fragmenting constituencies, is able to unify those constituencies through an antagonistic political discourse, and to I would say to own the issues advanced by these different movements and to integrate them into a populist frame. So if you have some question about probably the more nuanced way in which party organization of these different paths differentiate themselves, or the effects of those different paths in terms of social base of the electorate, I would be willing to answer. But I think, I mean, this is would say the broad argument that I try to build in order to explain the very different experiences that we observed in the countries that I selected. So thank you very much.